We've got two absolutely brilliant sessions ahead of us, and I'm hoping this one is going to turn out to be quite a lively debate. Guarding our patch or growing without borders, the future of Australian agriculture. I'm going to leave James to set the stage and really steer the discussions over the next 55 minutes. And I'm really delighted to introduce him. He leads the Trade and Global Change Programme at ABARES, with his team providing research and evidence-based economic advice on agricultural trade and cross-border issues to government and the public, with research supporting Australia's international representation through robust evidence-based. Having published academic works on the gains from agricultural trade liberalisation and on the quantification of non-tariff barriers on a bilateral and commodity level, James is perfectly placed to facilitate these discussions. So now over to you, James.
Thanks, Claire, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the great debate. Should we enjoy the riches that open trade has brought us, or should we bring up the drawbridge and just protect our industries? My name's James Fowler, and as Claire was saying, I lead the trade team at ABARES. I want to welcome you to our debate this afternoon. This is an afternoon session on the second day, so we actually want to make it lively. We don't want you to fall asleep. We do want provocative questions from you here today in the audience and online. Brett just said maybe he doesn't want questions. This will be different to a panel session. This is framed as a debate, and I want you, the audience, to know that. We've asked speakers to come with their strong and strident opinions. I just got to apologise for my slightly hoarse voice. It wasn't the Sundowners last night. It was a gift from a toddler. As I said, this won't be like a high school debate. It's not going to be, my left side here versus my right side here. I don't want to lock speakers in to views that they don't have. So we have four individuals here. We have a four-sided debate. I've got to point out, it's hard to track down anti-trade speakers in Australia. Perhaps that's a bit of foresight on what's to come in this debate. I wish Maximo was still here. He's had to head off to South America, but he could have provided some insight on some other views in other parts of the world. But everybody here today on the stage comes with different nuances to that trade message. We'll give each speaker a few minutes to lay out their argument for their vision for trade. And I think after about 20 minutes, I'll take some questions from the audience and also from online. Claire will be kindly reading out our online questions. Now, in favour of open trade is that free trade agreements and reductions in WTO tariffs have brought significantly improved opportunities to Australian agricultural exporters. And this covers higher prices for exporters and increased opportunities for volumes as well. We've seen Australian agriculture grow significantly. We saw that yesterday in some of Jared's words and slides and from the ABARES analysts yesterday. And a lot of that growth has been spurred by changes since 1995 in the world trading environment when the World Trade Organization started. Now, on the other hand, should we put up some barriers? Or should we subsidize some industries to nurture an industry and help build that industry to the point where it can develop these economies of scale and become internationally competitive? We'll hear today from a range of different speakers, and I just wanted to highlight some of the quotes that we've had from other people in the conference already. Hamish McIntyre, the NFF president, he said, "Up and down, that's how farmers in Australia remain viable." We heard from Maximo about a few different themes in one go. He said onshoring, food sovereignty and strategic autonomy, friendshoring. Another theme there is also non-tariff barriers. A quote from Maximo Torero, who was the UN Food and Agriculture Organization chief economist, was, "You need trade. You need it to be secure." And that was in relation to drought in Australia. Maximo also said food self-sufficiency is impossible. So that's an interesting, talking point for this debate, but also for the food security panel coming up. And I'll just point out, we will touch on food security. I think it's impossible to not touch on food security in relation to trade, but we will try and constrain it because that is the topic of the next session. And Catherine de Fontenay from the Productivity Commission said, the market is the world, and that has been hugely valuable for Australian farmers. Now, I did have a little bit of a tech problem up here. You might have noticed I switched to my paper. So I'm just going to grab my questions, my leading questions. We'll go first to Margo.
Hi.
Hi, Margo. Margo is the CEO of Australian Pork Limited. And I'm going to introduce each speaker, I think, individually, so I can stop talking. Margo, Australian agriculture has embraced open trade, but not all industries have benefited. What about pig meat? And who are the winners and losers from market access changes? And how should we be safeguarding, or should we be safeguarding domestic production and processing? And how could we do that? Pretty broad kind of question there.
It is, but I mean, the easy place to start is, if I keep the Australian pork hat on first before I go up to agriculture. Australian pork's incredibly privileged to feed Australians, highly nutritious, well-priced protein. What we see is that 85% of our produce actually stays here in Australia. We only export about 15% of it. What we've seen in the change, and I always love this conversation around free trade agreements, it's actually not free. What we would love is fair trade agreements. We find from the import perspective, many of you may not know that 80% of your ham and bacon is imported. And a lot of us rely on the golden kangaroo and the green triangle that we're buying Australian. We're actually not. It's a tiny bar chart underneath that you have to start looking at what those products actually are and where they come from. And we're finding more and more that the products that are coming in from other countries, they don't meet the same standards as us in terms of what they have to go through from a regulatory environment. They have subsidies, they have different avenues that actually make their cost of production less than ours. So it's not a free trade agreement that we get in return because it's not a fair playing field. So from the pork industry perspective, you don't even take into account the cost that's involved in bringing those products in, let alone just the actual finance, the transport, the freezing, the cooking, all of those sort of things. It's the opposite as well of the biosecurity. Australia has kept out the top 10 exotic diseases in this country. And what price are we putting on that if FMD came into the country? A couple of $100 billion, African swine fever, 50 billion. So I'm actually really on the side of Team Australia, that we are doing some fantastic things here to keep our country safe, to keep our industry safe, to keep food flowing. But we're actually increasingly finding ourselves faced with how do we keep those inputs coming on that we have stopped manufacturing here? How do we have all those reliance? We've lost our automation, our automotive industries, our Wi-Fi, things like that we've commercialised overseas. We've stopped actually really focusing on Australia for the team world. But at what point do we actually put Team Australia first and support it? And what is the true cost of what we're importing into our country? So even if you look at tariffs are an adjustment. They adjust in price and things like that. But the non-trade barriers, they're the things that are actually going to put our industry out of business. So I think for me, you can use the term free, but what we're actually after is a fair trade. So
an argument there for a more level playing field, and potentially that could boost domestic industry.
Yeah, and we often hear people talk about that, we do need to operate in the global world and we need to have partnerships across the globe. But we also have to realise what we have to offer here and what price we're putting on that and what we're giving away versus what we're actually purchasing to bring back in. So, yeah, I think we have to make a decision around, do we invest in manufacturing here? And we talked about food security and things like that. Years ago, everyone had a veggie patch, had a water tank, had things like that. Now, if your water goes, your power goes, most people don't even have a battery. They don't have a torch. They don't have a radio, things like that. So we're losing something in this reliance on overseas that I think we probably need to stand tall and bring back a little bit before we give it all away and we're so reliant on others that when the border's shut, we're a bit stuck.
So I might switch to you, Prue. Some industries clearly have not benefited from open trade. My mic's back on. Some industries have not benefited from open trade, and there are, winners and losers from policy reform. Is trade a zero-sum game, or are there net gains?
That's a no-brainer, James, no-brainer. Australian agriculture would be a dry, empty husk of itself without international markets and exports. And Margo, I love you. But seriously, I thought I was listening to a European then for a minute, or maybe someone from MAGA. Seriously, yes. No, Australian agriculture, if you look at the growth in grains, the grain sector in Australia, the meat sector, even horticulture, wine is going through challenging times, but the reason it's going through challenging times is because of the massive growth that it experienced as a result of its ability to access international markets. So no brainer, there are absolutely benefits for Australian agricultural producers from their ability to access international markets. Absolutely agree, Margo. Free trade, it's a stupid word, free. But actually fair is also not a great word. I mean, what does fair actually mean? And it's used all the time, and I think it's really problematic. Trade, when you look at the global market and you look at how Australian agriculture engages with it, it's essentially about the ability of Australian producers to supply customers overseas. And the process of doing that has to jump through multiple hurdles, multiple regulatory systems, multiple transport and logistics systems, which are in many ways sort of magnified from those that they need to jump through in order to access domestic producers. So it's more complicated. And what's happened with the trade agreements over the last 80 to 50 years was one of the key barriers that business had to jump through were government regulations. So these FTAs were set up to try and pull government out of markets, to reduce the number of hoops that businesses had to jump through in order to get their product to customers overseas. So FTAs, the WTO agreements created greater certainty, reduced those barriers, which helped business. What we've seen in the since about 2018, was government starting to step back in. And that was essentially China with its state-led, export-led growth model, seeing China increasingly direct its imports, and as Australia saw firsthand with the imposition of tariffs on Australian products, basically the weaponisation of trade. Now with President Trump, we've seen the US do the same thing, basically use trade as a geopolitical tool. So in response, governments around the world, including Australia's own government, is increasingly intervening in markets. So exporters who want to access international customers are once again having to navigate massive government interventions in markets, which are much more difficult to predict, particularly with President Trump, who likes to tweet things out at the drop of a hat. So the question for me is not, oh, we need to be Team Australia. We are Team Australia by actually going out to the world. We benefit massively by going out to the world. The question for me is we need to understand what the key vulnerabilities are, and I have real questions. People that say Australia has a food security problem, seriously, we don't have, depends on the definition, of course, but Australia seriously doesn't have a food security issue. What we need to do is identify what are our true vulnerabilities, and in things like fertiliser, whether we should onshore some key inputs. This isn't ag, but I worked on the blood fractionation review. You know how everyone, here we go, I'm going a little bit off topic. How people donate blood, and the CSL, Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, old CSL, have a monopoly to fractionate blood in Australia. And the US were really annoyed, and they said, we want access to that market to be able to fractionate blood in Australia. And one of the reasons we said it was because we wanted to secure supply, but actually the potential problems for factories breaking down in Australia from domestic issues were as equally, would make that industry as vulnerable as if we had international supply. So basically, what I'm trying to say is international supply reduces vulnerability. We had Mac here. He said when the US imposes tariffs or China imposes tariffs, we move to another market. So in terms of being able to not only build our industry, build our agricultural sector, but also increase the security and resilience of that sector, international markets are a critical part of that equation.
Thank you, Prue, and I've got to apologise. I neglected to introduce Prue. Prue is the head of the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment, ACITI, and Prue is a former diplomat and also an advisor to 3 trade ministers. I'm going to go next to you, Brett. Brett is the president of the Victorian Farmers Federation, and we're very fortunate to have Brett here. He's made the, I don't know how many hour drive, 6-7 hour drive from Quambatook in northwestern Victoria. And you run a mixed farming business with your family. And we heard a little bit there where Prue was touching, I guess, on what you could call, sovereign processing capacity and ideas around that. And you've gone on the record talking about biofuels and about nurturing a domestic industry there. Should we be nurturing domestic industries? Should we place greater emphasis on processing capacity, for example, for biofuels? And what options are there for governments to improve competitiveness? And should they be improving competitiveness?
Thanks, James. The answer is yes. I could leave it there to all of it. We've got a massive opportunity, and yes, like to Prue's point, we absolutely in this country rely on good trade relationships. We will always produce more food than we can consume here. We need trade to be really important, but we can do more with the food we're producing here as well before it leaves our shores, or even if it's to stay here. We are right in the middle of, I don't know, just before the weekend, Israel and US decided to pick a fight, and the world is feeling the symptoms of that right now, and we're, conversations in media around things like fuel security, fertiliser security, what are markets doing, what will inputs do, and it's not uncommon that we have this. It was a few years ago we had Russia pick the fight. We've had multiple of these episodes where COVID even created similar things. It's not our first rodeo in this sort of situation, but we don't seem to change anything in this country. And there's will it create better prices for farmers by producing biofuels here in Australia? Marginally, we're still going to be on export parity, so our prices as farmers isn't necessarily going to get any better, maybe, as I said, marginally, but what it will do is give us security. It will, the next time someone picks a fight in the globe, we will have a level of domestic manufacturing of, be it be biofuels, be it be sustainable aviation fuel and that we have that little bit of security that, we don't panic buy and queue up outside service stations to make sure our car's full of fuel because we know we have a buffer here, and that's really important. It's really important security for our farmers who, as much as we try to electrify the world, geez, we've got a lot of road to do before we can electrify our farmers completely, I can tell you now. I could safely invest in another diesel tank and it will wear out before I need to replace it with batteries, I can assure you of that. So we are going to rely on fuels, liquid fuels for a long, long time in this country, and we need to be more secure, we need to be more independent, and maybe even have that little bit of a price buffer so that when we do see a war or something like that, we don't see prices explode. Prue touched on fertilisers. It does my head in, as half of our nation's farmers are struggling with the impact of renewable energy being put onto agriculture land, and how do you manage a farming business alongside that? How can both coexist? It does my head in that we are not using that clean green energy to produce urea here domestically. It's almost a no-brainer, like to be able to reduce our greenhouse emissions on that urea before it reaches a farm gate, as well as utilising some of the benefits of that clean energy, and take a lot of the conflict out of rural communities. It drives me mad that we are not forward thinking as a country to be able to do that. And whether it is whether a lot of these things are being held back by the simple question of it's really expensive to do business, to manufacture anything here in Australia. There's a real question and I would love to see a biofuels plant, James, but maybe it's cheaper to send the canola to China and bring back the biofuels. And that's pretty scary if that's the case, that we as a country can't be better than that.
So you've raised some really interesting topics there, I think, which I'm going to come back to, particularly on who pays. And I know the intensive livestock industry will be interested in that as well. One other thing here is, if we had a strong rules-based system, would we have less disruption? So I'm going to go to Patricia Holmes from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Now, we did have to do a last-minute change to our program. We were going to have George Mina from DFAT, the former ambassador to the WTO and the head of the trade group at DFAT. But we're very grateful that we have Patricia here today. Patricia leads the International Trade Law and Economic Security Division, how topical. And Patricia was George's deputy at the WTO and also former ambassador to Argentina, amongst other things. So, Patricia, you're the former deputy ambassador to the WTO. In this era of increasing strain on the global trading system with all these disruptions, why is Australia pushing to maintain an open, inclusive and sustainable rules-based system? I could perhaps take it further if I want to be provocative and say, are efforts at the WTO just like Sisyphus, pushing a boulder up a hill, have it fall down repeatedly? Or perhaps that's one for Peru later.
Okay, thanks, James. And can I just start by passing George's apologies. He's unfortunately had to travel back to Melbourne for family reasons. I know he would have really loved to be here. For many of you who would know him, agriculture and agricultural trade is something very close to his heart, which I have. I've served actually twice in Geneva with George, including when he was the agriculture councillor, and I've seen him pushing that boulder really hard. And I think you have to think about, I think it's the situation where we have to keep pushing that boulder, even though it's going to be challenging and it's not falling over us. And actually, if you look back over decades, we have done well, and Australia really has prospered from the rules-based system. And I think if we close to the world, we would be less prosperous and less secure. And I think for a sector like agriculture, that's even more clear. I think, yes, we've seen the introduction of the US tariffs and the uncertainty in that space. Global trade has been reshaped by heightened geostrategic competition, greater use of industry assistance and the net zero transition. So it's certainly, we're moving into a new stage of trade generally, and it is extremely challenging. And I think forums like this, where we're actually having conversations about Australia, we are all Team Australia. How are we going to address these challenges and balance these priorities? Because they all cost money, right? So which part of which industry is going to support other industries that we deem do need to be supported, onshored, whatever. So these are really serious, important, challenging conversations, and I think not one part of the society, certainly not the government, has all the answers. But from an agriculture perspective, we export at least 70% of the food we produce, so we really do need those markets and those markets to be open. If we look at the WTO, yes, having spent years there, including on the trade law side and disputes, including on sugar into the EU, for example, it is difficult, it is challenging, but there's still committee work going on. There's still pressure being put on countries to explain themselves, including on NTBs, and some progress is being made. I think also the free trade agreements are really important. They, whether they're fair, whether they're free, whether they're perfect, no. And you can have discussions around what exactly does that mean. The point is they improve the situation. If we had none of these rules and none of these free trade agreements and business didn't know what tariff they were even going to face every time they exported, and there was no basis for challenging or engaging with our trading partners, we would be far worse off. So I think we've really benefited. It would be better for us if the system, if we're all in a kind of happy rules-based system, but what can we do to try and maintain, stop it from slipping back? With many of our trading partners, that's a key challenge for us going forward. And I mean, I also would just add, with the sort of economic security and hat on and food security as a part of that, that demand for food in the region particularly is important, and I think that will be growing. So there's sort of the two sides we see of food security around the self-reliance narrative, but also the reliable supply narrative. And I think that's where I think that what we're hearing, and I was just in Philippines last week with ASEAN discussions, it's shifting to that reliable supply, and that's where Australia has such a strong advantage by saying we're reliable, we will be complying with our obligations and commitments where we've made them, and we have really good standards, we can supply the market. And I'd just finish by saying, and it's not to say that there aren't places where subsidised product will be coming in cheaper. Obviously, some part of another economy is paying that. Agriculture has experienced this. It's always been such a protected and sensitive sector that you've always had more experience than other sectors that we're seeing. But it is, of course, something that we have to continue to consider, engage, and push Australia's interests.
So, Prue, you have a podcast, Trade Policy Decoded, and your co-host, Peter Draper from Adelaide University, Institute of International Trade. I didn't quite catch everything he was saying in early February, I think it was. But he mentioned at some stage, either himself or somebody saying about the rules-based system being a falsehood. And, we've seen in the media talk yesterday about a rules-based order being a fantasy land. Is it? And secondly, what's the counterfactual here? Do we have no rules and just a free-for-all?
I wouldn't say anything, Peter. We'll let Peter speak for himself. Look, 70% of world trade continues to operate under WTO rules. That might be slipping, but 70% is a big number. The key, what we're seeing here is the challenge to the rules has been happening for a long time. Part of that is to do with the institution of the WTO. Originally, we saw countries start to move towards free trade agreements because they weren't able to get what they wanted in the WTO. Then, so proliferation of free trade agreements. What we're seeing now, it's like this huge flipping of the system with the two big gorillas in the room, US and China, basically saying the rules aren't working for us, and China sort of does it quietly and doesn't necessarily operate within the spirit of the global trade rules. And then the US being quite overt about saying the rules aren't working for us anymore. But then there's this huge inertia. International trade operated pretty well before the WTO existed, and it's going to continue to operate because there is this demand for things that people produce. There's a demand, people want what's produced. So there's this big flip at the top with the two biggest markets in the world no longer complying or really conducting themselves in a way that is consistent with the WTO rules. But then there's this huge institutional stickiness and vested interest in maintaining rules and operating your day-to-day business in accordance with what you assume will be the conditions under which you trade. And that's really not going to move fast. And I actually think we are in a period of great power politics. We are no longer We no longer have key players that are invested in rules and rules-making systems. So what I actually think what Australia needs to do, what the ag sector needs to do, is sort of wake up. The world's changed. We're in a period of geopolitical great power politics. If we want to play in this space successfully, then we need to get even smarter than we have been before in terms of understanding the implications of decisions made in capitals and by governments. As I said before, business needs to be much more attuned to what government is going to do in terms of benefiting their own market, doing the things that Margo said. And when you see the role of populist policies increasingly influencing domestic governments, ultimately international politics is domestic politics. So understanding this shift towards, the rise of one nation in Australia, they're populist policies, they're not really focused on data-based good policy decisions. They're focused on things that sound right, like, we should look after Australia, we should look after America. Looking after Australia is engaging with the world. So I think we're at this period where the rules, people want rules. Business wants and needs certainty. They're being challenged. To the extent that they benefit the big guys, some rules will remain, but the scope for them to change quickly is massively increased. And so for Australian businesses, agricultural exporters to continue to succeed, they just need to really ramp up their understanding of what's happening in the global economy, what's happening with political decision-making at that level.
Ask James, on that note, how effective are our free trade agreements? It feels a little bit like, and I'm not sure how we got on one nation, but anyway, we'll skip it. But it feels a little bit like we put an enormous amount, and I'll say I'm a big fan of free trade agreements, so don't quote me that I'm not, but we put an enormous amount of time, energy, cost, effort into creating these free trade agreements, and we celebrate them when we've won them, and it feels like every other country that trades with that country is like a Meg Ryan movie, I'll have what she's having, sort of thing. And all of a sudden your free trade agreement doesn't really mean that much anymore, and it happens very quickly. And we talk about, we had a free trade agreement with China when barley tariffs were introduced, and we didn't seem to be able to negotiate or interact with the country. With what, as you say, what Trump does, which is kind of, this, political move or whatever to introduce a tariff on the world, as Trump had put it, then, where's the value of a free trade agreement? Are they the right mechanism, maybe? Is that the question? I don't know what I'm asking. But
yeah, I'd love to answer that. I think no one in this room would remember life before trade agreements and what trade was like for agricultural producers before the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which came into effect in 1948. And so we're like the frogs in the hot water bath. We're so used to having a foundation that sets global trade rules. We're so used to that. And that system is slowly disintegrating. Are they benefiting us? Absolutely. Have we absolutely taken it for granted that we will be able to trade and access markets? Absolutely. So when I say wake up, things are changing, and we have to realise that all the conditions that underpinned global trade and Australia's engagement with the global market before are wearing away. So things are going to get very ugly before we all go around and go, oh my gosh, guess what rules would be a really good idea? It's going to get bad, and then we'll figure it all out again, which happened during the Second World War and the Great Depression. We do these stupid things and then figure it out.
Now, time's getting on. I do want to move on. Did anybody want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say that it really goes to add to Prue's point. It's when it doesn't work that we really notice it. But 80% of our two-way trade is traded under free trade agreements. There's still a lot of trade. It's gone from sort of 82 to 72 of trade is still under WTO rules. Yes, of course, when the US and China take policy steps and actions for, geostrategic reasons or for, across the globe, this is what we're saying, that times have shifted and the system has been upended. But we do have, like having a trade agreement and having the WTO were really important in the eventual ability of the government to resolve those trade issues with China. And yes, should they have been put in place? No. Should they have been removed immediately? Yes. But ultimately those mechanisms were useful in achieving that. And similarly with the US system, as we've said, consistently, we don't think this is appropriate. We certainly think that, the 10% tariff and the IEPA tariff and now coming, the Section 122 tariffs and who knows what's coming next, that's not consistent with our free trade agreement. But having a free trade agreement means that the baseline is zero. So when you add the 10%, we're in a better position. So is it ideal? No. But is it a better position? And I think that's the point, that we cannot take it for granted. It's really going to be challenging, and there are these positions, particularly from the big players, that we're going to have to keep navigating, but it's definitely better than the counterfactual.
Margo, rules-based system, is there an alternative?
Yeah, well, I just think that I don't think anyone's saying that we shouldn't be doing trade, but it is the rules that we're doing that trade under. And I think, Patricia, you made a really good comment of someone gets traded off. I mean, I think that's what some of us feel in the industries of what's going to get traded off to get the deal done. And we understand the smooth trade, we understand all of that, but it's actually what those agreements are being based on. And Prue, I will go to the One Nation thing of the comment of that. I think there is a real risk that you're not listening to Australians and what Australians are actually after and what they're feeling and their fear and things like that. So I don't think anyone's saying don't trade. I just think that it does feel at times that those taps are turned off. So whilst we're a rules-based system, not everyone paying by the rules and the rules changing as you go, does impact people right like that. So meat gets stuck on the water, grain, fertiliser, the borders get closed, things like that. So I think that we have to actually listen to what's happening here and actually be willing to look at the broader Australian picture, but also what we have to offer the rest of the world as well, as opposed to trading off what we have and what those deals are and what those returns are.
Now, I just want to point out, I will eventually get to questions online and from the floor, but I did want to get back to what I promised I'd talk about, this question of who pays. If we have government interventions in a market, and Brett, as I said earlier, you've talked publicly about the benefits, at least to some, of the development of a biofuels processing industry in Australia. I know there was a former British Prime Minister who, I won't give the full quote, but they said, on whom does the whip hand fall? On whom does the whip fall? Perhaps I could go to you, Margo. Development of, for example, a domestic industry. Who pays, for example, if there was a biofuels industry? Does it affect others in society? And, it's really a question, I guess, what cost are we willing to pay? And we could then, segue to, I think, Patricia and Prue.
It's an interesting topic, but I often think we look at it wrong. Like, we look at who pays. But when we see innovations like our Wi-Fi, and I know AgriFuture's wonderful Evoke Ag last week had a lovely young man who was inventing a grazemate application, which could be a game changer, but he can't get it through regulatory environments here. He can't get through the funding and things like that. So we're sending all of these amazing things offshore for others who can see the bigger picture on it and capitalising on it. So I think yes, there's a question of who pays, but there's also the question of, well, what are we losing if we're not doing this? What are we giving away? Like, we could be world leaders in innovation. We have one of the best RDC frameworks in the globe that has government, industry, private sectors all working together on innovations, but it's hitting a wall. So how do we get that and capture it? So I do think that yes, there's a price to pay, but also look at what we're losing and what is that certainty? What's that security? There's lots of things in innovations we should be really proud of, but we're just letting them go offshore and letting other countries get them.
Can I just I think that's a really good point. But rather than putting up barriers to goods coming in, the key, so again segueing, the National Trade Survey has been run since 2014, Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry National Trade Survey. And the number, when businesses were surveyed and asked, what is your number one concern? Up until about 2023, they said international competitiveness. What are the factors that make us internationally competitive? That's what keeps them awake at night. And so 2 years ago, CT does the research for the survey. We said, well, what does that mean? What does international competitiveness mean? So we put in specific questions. We said, so when you say what factors undermine your international competitiveness, what are they? And so what came out were all those things that make any business internationally competitive. Tax rates, access to labour, access to skills, government regulation. So when you talk about a startup wanting to build a business here, ultimately what is going to enable Australia to maximise the benefits from engaging in global markets is our own international competitiveness. And with international trade, it's always a 50-50 thing. You know, it's, yes, other countries are imposing barriers, and that's 50% of the problem. The other 50% of the problem is how do we position Australian businesses, Australian agricultural producers, to be the most internationally competitiveness? And that goes to all this range of domestic factors that support someone who wants to get a good idea up. And at the moment, there is so much more we can do in that space.
Patricia, I might go to you. We can think about this idea of kind of enhanced like onshoring and processing capability as a bit like an insurance premium. You know, somebody pays the cost for less risk. Is that one way of thinking about it?
Okay, so I think you can take a step back and say there's a lot we can do to promote domestic capabilities to the 2 points that we've heard. I think around regulatory reform and enabling environment that there's a big focus of the government that doesn't cost money. So I think that's a key focus, and that will strengthen our own markets, because our own production capabilities and our own businesses, which will then make them more effective accessing overseas markets. The question then is where, so one of the ways that the kind of in Southeast Asia, the China and the US is framed as sort of China's presented a supply shock and the US a demand shock. And in some sectors, that's just really difficult to overcome in the short term. And that's where the question of domestic capability goes, where you really, the decision is made that we actually do need to support that domestic capability. And you see that in sort of the steel sector in Australia. So that's, I think, the point at which, and it maybe in agriculture, it's more inputs, right, rather than actual, because, you know, we don't, you know, the food security issue, go to so many other countries if you want to be sort of comparing and contrasting on food security. I mean, then there is how do we, just on the final point on how do we help navigate these challenges and these policies that are coming at us from different countries, especially when it's short term. And I do think the government has recognised that, and Australia's got the $50 million Accessing New Markets initiative to sort of support access into new markets and to diversify. So those are the kind of two angles to that challenge that we're facing.
Now, we don't have, Brett wants to add to that.
Can I just say, is it such a bad thing that government invest in supporting agriculture? We have this big pride thing in agriculture in Australia where, hey, we're the least subsidised country in the world. That isn't a good thing. That tells us that our government sometimes doesn't give a rat's about us. You know, and I'm sure they do. I'm sure they love us, but it's not like we don't subsidise other industries in this country. I mean, go and buy some prescription medication. Like the PBS is $19 billion a year spent by the Australian government on that because it keeps us healthy. What does food do? Food keeps us healthy, and we get nothing. Like, you know, to think about government investing in manufacturing that, A, secures our inputs, or B, consumes some of our goods here in Australia, or builds that capability here in Australia. Why is it such a bad thing that government should contribute?
So, it's just
sorry.
Where do I start, Rick? So government should be supporting communities through healthcare services infrastructure. In terms, do you want a government telling you what you should be planting or what you should be growing this year? That's what happens in Europe. You know, in China, there's a wonderful report out this morning from Rhodium Group that's showing the decay in the Chinese economy because in part, government investment is killing value within the Chinese economy. It's basically, and there was an earlier report that showed for every dollar invested in the United States, you get the return on investment in the United States is 10 times greater than it is in China. Subsidies, governments, I love you, Patricia, but have you met a public servant that is good at deciding how a particular sector should be paid for what, to produce what? It's like, we used to do industry policy back in the 50s. We were okay at it. We've lost even the little bit of capability we have is gone. So if you want, I can just see it now in terms of listening, Margo, if you want governments telling you what you should be producing, when you should be producing it, here's a subsidy, but you need to make sure that you export this amount to here in this country, yeah, it's pretty ugly, Brett.
But I guess I'm probably not arguing so much for subsidies, but more for, is it bad to invest in some of those end markets for our products? Like, sustainable aviation fuel, if we're going to do that. Like, why is it such a bad thing that government should be contributing to that? I mean, it's reducing our emissions. We all want that, don't we? I do, anyhow. One person in the room. I assume there's others. So, some of these things are public good, but we seem to leave it, say, oh no, it's private business should be doing that. So.
The government is Future Made in Australia, a suite of programs. They've selected particular sectors, so green hydrogen, green steel, I think solar panels, specific sectors that the government is absolutely stepping into, both for climate change emissions reduction reasons, but also national security reasons, trying to break China's control of critical minerals.
And I'm going to, I think, interrupt there. It's a brilliant discussion, and we just clearly do not have enough time. I think it also comes back to a question of at what cost, and is it the best use of money? I mean, not everyone wants a handout, Brett. But we do have a question from online. Claire, we can't see you, but I trust that you've got a question.
Yeah, we do. We've got a question from Rohan Fernandez, who's asked, given the increasingly unpredictable nature of the larger export players like the US, China and India, what steps can be taken to position Australia for more favourable negotiations in the agricultural sector with these countries?
Well, I think we might rephrase that as what should Australia do, not what steps can Australia take to reposition ourselves or position ourselves better. Margo, would you like to talk about your vision for what Australia should be doing?
Yeah, and I think if I'm listening to the question properly, it's around how we can get more focused on those markets and get access. I think that's what the question is. Apologies if I've got it a bit wrong. And I think actually Prue just hit the nail on the head is how do we have that connection between what we manufacture, what we create, what we build here in Australia into the people who are actually sitting at the tables making those trade agreements, making those discussions, having those one-to-one government discussions. Because we do know, like with all respect to the government, it's the government sitting there having those conversations. You don't want, 1,000 farmers sitting at the table. So we do have that conduit of what that looks like. So how do you really strengthen the flow of information, the understanding, to make sure that whatever those channels are, we focus it, but we truly understand what we're trying to achieve. And even in reverse of the agreements coming back into Australia, what price, and I don't mean price in dollars, so sorry, as James is an economist, I mean what is the impact of those decisions here of that trade coming in, because I think there's still a disconnect at that higher level. So maybe there's a connection, understanding, information, and that's on all of us. That's not just on government, just on industry, just on business.
I think you've touched on a really important point there, and I'm going to go to you, Prue. Do governments need to be more open?
Absolutely. Sorry, again. So
you can have a right of reply.
The Australian government's traditional approach to managing markets for the last 50 years has been, as I said, get out of markets and let business do what business needs to do. And that's part of the free trade agreement agenda. Because the world has changed, the way government needs to engage with business also has to, particularly in Australia, absolutely change if we are to successfully navigate what is here now, the new global economy. And I say that because in order for government to achieve its national security and its emissions reduction goals, it relies on business. It relies on investment in green energy and green industry. It relies on business to be cognizant of the national security vulnerabilities created by trade. And the only way business is able to be cognizant of that is if they're aware of it. And at the moment, the narrative in Australia is we have our Prime Minister going to China and saying, let's do business with China, we're open for trade. And often behind closed doors, they're saying, and I've heard this at a briefing, we're essentially at war with China. And then the United States, we have, I think, essentially we've really tied our wagon to the United States. When you see the Prime Minister come out and absolutely support the attack in Iran sort of unconditionally, maybe not unconditionally, maybe that's unfair, but I think so the only way that the government's going to achieve this national security emissions trading is by working with business, and the only way business is best able to manage the risk of geopolitical disturbances to markets is by getting a better handle on what's happening at the geopolitical level, and government is a key source of information. So, yep, I think the Services Export Action Plan, if anyone ever heard of that, it was an initiative where business and government met, formulated industry plans. It was for promoting services exports, but I think it's a model that could be applied across the board.
I'm going to jump to you, Patricia. I think we need some clarifications.
Yes.
For example, we're not at war with trading partners.
So I guess first point, there's a lot to sort of address there, and I'm only one part of the government, so I would put that as a caveat, and I'll leave it to the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister to comment on our views in relation to the war in the Middle East. But I would say a couple of points. Obviously, Australia can maintain a calm and considered voice supporting rules-based trade and the benefits of at least a degree of openness and the benefits that can provide to countries, including regional countries and middle power countries. Yes, there's the US and China, and that is challenging to engage with, but there's an awful lot of other countries that we do trade with and we do engage with, and there's a lot of forums where those compelling arguments can consistently be made, and we are not alone. And that's, the WTO, that's the G20, that's APEC, that's within ASEAN, and at the OECD. We're also, we've negotiated a lot of FTAs. There's a lot of effort into upgrading, improving, utilising those FTAs. And then, of course, we are working hard to conclude negotiations with the EU on the FTA and to upgrade the agreement with India. India, as I'm sure you all know, notoriously challenging to negotiate with, but big market, and we will keep doing that. So I think that there's a couple of areas where we do keep going, we will keep arguing, and we will get benefits for business. Couple of points, we do a lot of outreach, there's a lot of engagement with business, continue to engage with our free trade agreement and stakeholder engagement division, and I know DAF and other agencies do as well. Knock on the door and it will be answered. And there's a lot of engagement with FTA on FTAs, and just also like on the Future Made in Australia, it has the two pillars, the net zero and the economic security, and there is a lot of understanding of these questions around where we need to invest in domestically, National Reconstruction Fund. So there's quite a lot of effort that the government is putting into this agenda.
And so you touched there on why government would invest in, certain services, certain goods, certain infrastructure, and that's where there's a broader public benefit than supplied in the private market. We've got a question at the back of the room, noting that we've got 5 minutes left.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a fascinating discussion, chomping at the bit to ask this question, and I don't think I'm the only one. So Carl Ellis from Dairy Australia, definitely acknowledging that WTO and the FTAs have delivered really significant gains for exporters in lowering tariffs, but in terms of a level playing field, they have been found wanting when we come to talk about agricultural domestic support. The OECD measures, direct agricultural financial support. The EU and the US both put over US $100 billion into their ag sector. In contrast, and to Brett's point, Australia puts in 2.7. we're at a significant sort of disadvantage or difference in terms of the emphasis we put on that sector compared to our trading partners in that regard. Is it time Australia takes unilateral action inspired by the EU's CBAM and look at things such as an agricultural support border adjustment mechanism?
I think there's a whole bunch of issues there, particularly ending on the CBAM. But I'll take the first part of the question, right, talking about domestic support. Because, we've been talking about FTAs, but then domestic support is another kettle of fish. And perhaps this is now coming back full circle, Margo, to some of what you were talking about. I mean, in Australia, we get a lot of Danish pig meat imports.
Yeah, we do. And, to go to the equal or level playing field, I think was a really good language on how we do that. But it really does come back to that. I don't think any farmer in Australia is sitting there saying they want subsidies. I think it's around where that money's actually going. And I've heard people talk about the National Reconstruction Fund and all those sort of things. It's not like the money's flowing out of a lot of these funds. So what are they investing in and what is the benefit to Australia of some of these money and where they're going to? So I think that level playing field is such an important thing on where those investments are going. They don't have to go straight to a hip pocket, but it's around the tax reforms, it's around the deals and all of that. And I'm not sure if you want to add.
I might just add to this, Brett. If you were a farmer in the EU, you'd be getting a payment based on the area you planted last year.
Yes.
How do you like the sound of that?
I've been incredibly frustrated because I'm so restricted in what I can do. Yeah, look, I agree. I don't think farmers are asking for subsidies, but I do believe there is, and we're back on One Nation, I've brought us there, sorry. I believe that we are seeing a discontent in rural Australia right now, that they feel like our government, our leaders, are looking at rural Victoria not as an agricultural food basket, but as vacant land, prime for whatever use they might determine needs to be used. And I feel like there is a mindset shift that needs to change amongst our leaders. And it's really important because our producers are the best in the world. Like I'm proud Victorian. 2 to 3% of Australia's agricultural land sits in Victoria. Of that $101 billion, we produce a quarter of that out of Victoria. Our farmers are the best in the world at what they do, and we're combining them with the best land, and yet they're treated like they've got empty space. Why don't we tell you what we're going to do with that? Why don't we, maybe to Prue's point, to tell you how we should farm? There's a little bit of that going on, but they're not telling us to farm anything. They're telling us to build infrastructure or to dig it up for mines or whatever it might be. And I'm not wanting to get into that land use debate, but we need a mindset change in our leaders.
So we've got 90 seconds
left.
We've got 90 seconds left, and I will jump to you, Prue, in a tick. I think what's really important here is that we kind of come around and say, what is our objective through trade? I'll jump
Can I
to you.
answer that question first? I think everyone's working on the assumption that we've still got this rules-based system, that it's going to continue functioning. We need to wake up. You talk about being unfair. Without any rules at all, the Europeans can subsidise whatever they like. The Chinese can subsidise whatever they like. We might be the best in the world. Who cares? It doesn't matter. We're in a whole new world. We're in a world of geopolitical great powers who decide what they want and what they think is best for their country. And if an Australian farmer, Australian beef farm, if Donald Trump wakes up tomorrow and decides he wants to support the US beef sector and say, we're no more Australian, he can do that because that's the world we are in at the moment. So for Australia to subsidise, the only way we're going to survive this new global order is by being even more competitive and being able to provide goods that are compelling, because things have changed. We're in a different world, so we need to wake up.
I'll take those as some final words. We've got 4.5 minutes. Oh, I won't actually, because I swear that's jumped. Thank you. We're going to go to the back of the room where we've got another question, and we might try and do it really quick, because if we can, we'll try and take another one from online.
Thank you. So I just wanted to get back to the topic of the debate about sort of the drawbridge up or the focus outwards, and it seems to me you've got this position of the free trade or the protectionist kind of thing, but I'm saying there's sort of another, increase our competitiveness, but how can we compete with, say, a China that can have labour at 5 cents an hour and can have their currency 6 times lower than it should be or whatever, because they can control it. So national security, so the biofuels, maybe we need this additive in our fuel because everything's trucked in Australia, right? So that's a national security thing. What if because that comes from China, right? So what if we can't get that, So is there like a distinction here between national security, protectionism, free trade, open borders, whatever? So there might be certain industries that we can justify supporting our domestic industries on a national security basis. So you were talking before about, there might be like some of these national funds and stuff. So do you want to elaborate on when should we be, domestically investing based on national security?
I might actually try and broaden that a little bit at the risk of time and say, what should our objective be, right? Should it be national security? Should it be incomes? Should it be food security? Should it be the environment? Or can it be all of them at the same time? Who'd like to go first?
I might go. If we can enable productivity, and I use that word quite specifically, enabling productivity across this country, then that frees up the space, the money and everything to do those other areas, environment, people, looking after things like that. So I think that should be a really clear objective. And I'll make it short and sharp because I'm out of time.
2 minutes left, and we still want to do a question online.
I agree with Margo. No surprise, probably Margo. But I think we need to enable our producers, our communities to thrive. And we say government stepped out of. We want government to be light touch. They're not. It certainly doesn't feel like it from a farmer point of view. It feels like government are very much in our lives. And so I think you're absolutely right. If we can enable our communities, our rural communities to thrive, our farmers to produce, and yes, we need to work with our trade opportunities because we do produce more food than we can consume.
I wish we had another 5 hours where I could quiz you more.
Can I add really quickly, when we talk about government though, we're not just talking federal. We need a push for harmonisation in this country across local, state and federal because it's not just federal. There's that harmonisation really required.
Objectives for policy or for the community as a whole through trade policy? What are we trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think if you look at it, so if I look at it from the new economic security perspective, there's a lot of discussion because this brings together these elements that I think you're referring to, and there we're talking about maintaining and increasing Australia's prosperity while ensuring our capacity to protect ourselves from shock and remain resilient. This is the kind of framing in terms of balancing it, right? And that can include not only where do we need to position ourselves for government to support in a way that perhaps is more active than in the past, and how do they do that? Not just through subsidies, but other mechanisms. How do we make Australia more competitive? Because I think, as Prue said, really, if you want to gain market share, it's by providing the best products at an effective price, but the best products, and be a reliable supplier. And then the third element to that is how do we protect, and whether that's through our quarantine measures or through, protect measures like investment screening and things like that that are more on the security side. That's a way of framing what actually is our objective. And just very quickly, I can't speak to every single level of government and their approach to agricultural farmers, but I would say in our negotiations, agriculture is really front and centre. And if George was here, he would give you a kind of informed from decades of working on agricultural policy. It really is at the front of our objectives and our thinking and our trading policy.
We do thank you very much for joining us at the last minute. I think that's important context. Yes. Prue, I did say final words, but we seem to have gone around. Did you want to say anything more?
I think I've said enough. Probably too much.
I won't say marvellous because we do love hearing from you. I might hand back over to Claire now. That does conclude. Sorry, we didn't have time for all the questions. There's questions left in the room. There's questions online, and I said we'd go to one online. We really don't have time. We got a 5-minute extension. We've already exceeded that. And I know you're all really interested about food security, another topic we've hardly touched on. And that'll be a great topic to cover up next.